If you've seen the latest James Bond trailer, you may be wondering where the Beige locations are.
Why would I betray you?
We all have our secrets. We just didn't get to yours yet. They are a few places in southern Italy. This is near Gravina di Puglia. Don't look at the view. But most of this is Matera. I've been there, and I thought I'd tell you about it. Just a few years ago, this place was obscure, but in 2019 it was the European capital of culture, and with its appearance in James Bond films and Lindybeige videos, its popularity is sure to soar.
The Sassi, as they are called, of Matera. Now, what are we looking at here behind me? This is one of the two main Sassi, these distinctive housing districts in Matera. And you think, well, why does it look like this? Why is it some sort of strange tableau? It looks as though it's been laid out to entertain the viewer so that you can see every single building on the hillside. Normally you look at a housing district and it's built on the flat and the near houses block your view of those further away, but here you can see pretty much all of every single property, or so it immediately seems. So why did they build like this? Well, first I want you to cast your imaginations back to a time before all that was there, and instead there was just a big, steep, rocky slope. And if you want to know what a big, steep, rocky slope looks like, well, you can see one across the way here. Now, across the way here, we have a huge archaeological park, and the very first settlements in this area, which have the claim of being the third oldest city in the world, but it's not the best of claims, I would say. One problem being that, how do you define a city? And nothing that I've seen here looks like a city to me. And calling it a civilization doesn't wash with me either, because these people weren't writing. But up in the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, there were loads of people building settlements on the top of that land there, and we've got plenty of archaeological evidence for that. Now, but you can see caves across there. But the first caves weren't actually for living in, they were for storage. But eventually you do get people, and the word troglodyte gets bandied about here quite a lot, living in caves. Now, if you want to live underground, which is pretty handy in this area, because you need to store water in cisterns, and one way to do that is to hack out a big underground opening, a cistern for storing. And what you can do is you can hack sideways into the side of the hill. Now, you could, of course, hack downwards from the top, but for a start you're losing a bit of useful farming land, and then you've got to go through the earth and you get to the crumbly rock. That's not very easy to dig, and then, okay, then you're into the good stuff and you start chipping down and down and down, and after a while you've got, well, you're going to have to start with a staircase, aren't you, because you need access to the place, and here you are, unless you've rigged up an awning, you're working in the sun, and after quite a lot of work you've got, great, some stairs that go down. You can't live in them, they don't shelter you, they're useless. So, all right, so then you start eventually tunneling sideways, and after a bit you've got a very small home, most of which is a staircase. Oh yeah, and every time it rains you get really wet. Why not find a steep bit and tunnel sideways into the limestone, which is quite soft rock, it's easy to tunnel into here. And then immediately you've got a shelter from the sun, and then you've got something that you can live in, and then you can expand and expand sideways into the hillside. So, in your imagination, what I want you to do is wipe away all these buildings that you can see, and imagine that behind all of those there are cave entrances instead, because those buildings were added later, and they are the extensions of those cave dwellings. So those buildings are actually, in some cases, a tiny fraction of the property. You might go into one of those doors, through a couple of rooms, then through an archway into a cave, which then leads to another cave, leads to another cave, and some of them are colossal. A lot of them have very big cisterns, or things that were once, when they were originally made, used as cisterns, water storage places. And so that's why it looks as it is, and it's a fascinating thing to see. You might think it worthwhile travelling a long way to see something just for its magnificent beigeness, but this is very unusual for lots of reasons, and one being its astonishing survival. Now, another thing you might be thinking is, why is this place not more famous? Why have I not heard about this? I mean, people hear about Florence and Venice and Pompeii and all these famous places. Well, yeah, Florence and Venice have been famous tourist destinations for generations, whereas here it's all rather new. And to give you an idea of just how new, just 5 years ago, there were about 300 places you could stay here, hotels, bed and breakfasts, that sort of thing, whereas now, 5 years on, there are well over 900. It's trebled in the last 5 years. This is really taking off, but it's actually quite new. Now, one reason for that is that until quite recently, this was considered one of the shames of Italy. After World War II, the government decided that it had to get rid of this shameful area. There were these poor people living with their animals in these tiny hovels, dark hovels. They didn't have proper modern windows. They weren't plumbed into the mains electricity or plumbing. And the government thought, we must do something about this. And so they did. So they bought up the areas of the Sassi and moved the people out into nice, modern, proper housing districts nearby. And it wasn't until the 1980s that a lot of people started thinking, well, you know, actually, it's got something. Maybe we can do something with this. And it started to be renovated a bit. The first electricity supplies were established in the Sassi in the 1950s. And it wasn't until the year 2000 that the Sassi was then plumbed in with modern supplies of clean drinking water. So perhaps that goes a long way towards explaining why this isn't a more established tourist destination. And now it's still the case that about 80% of these properties are owned by the state. And not many people have these as their first home. A lot of these are bed and breakfasts or novelty tourist shops or their second homes. A lot of them are second homes to people who live actually quite nearby, in perhaps those state-built houses that their families moved to in the 1950s. Perhaps the most extraordinary thing is that after they compulsorily purchased so many houses and moved everybody out, they didn't demolish the place, and thank goodness, because now Matera has something to show the world.
You can see the masses of close-packed buildings making an intricate 3D maze. That very clean building is the cathedral, the dome. It's all just so beige! Aerials. The cathedral was just back from the cleaners. My word, that's clean. We'll see how long it lasts. So many aerials.
I do wonder for how many more years that television aerials are going to blight the skylines of cities around the world, even cutesy touristy ones like this. There are plenty of homes in Britain where the television aerial on the roof hasn't been used for years. It's all cable and streaming services these days, and yet it seems that the modern person cares so little about the appearance of their home and so much about the risk of totally unnecessary death in trying to remove one that they're going to be sticking around for some while.
Do you like buttresses? They have buttresses. The best sort. Flying sort.
Talking to locals here, several have told me that the Sassi for them when they were children was the place to go and hide if you didn't want to be found by your school teachers or your parents. If you were playing truant from school, you would just go to the Sassi and meet your friends in such a maze that you're almost certain to lose any pursuers. They did say, though, that they didn't actually cover the place with graffiti, so presumably this is fairly recent. Had it been here for any length of time, I think it would have been cleaned off. It wasn't until 1993, I think, better look that up, see bottom of screen for details, that UNESCO recognised this as a World Heritage Site.
Ooh, UNESCO. This small museum showed a typical house of the Sassi, presented as it would have been at a certain date. You have to guess the date. It had an indoor loo there, and there was where you washed your hands. The back section of the home was rock-hewn cave, and is where the animals were kept. Today the walls are used to display a collection of tools to visitors. Perhaps these will help you to date the dwelling. At the front of the house, where smoke can escape, the cooker. The pottery is fairly timeless. And here the cot and the main bed. At least 7 people lived here. This was the clothes dryer, yarn reel, a pump drill, Mesolithic technology, sieves for food processing, some weighing scales there. This was the family grain silo with 2 dispensing hatches, one for animals, one for people, and at its foot is a Neolithic-style quern for grinding grain into flour. The washing machine. Well, have you guessed the date?
1960.
If you guessed 1800, I forgive you.
Now, the term cave gets used quite a lot, and that's understandable. The trouble with the word cave is it does suggest something very rough and perhaps naturally occurring, and most of these are definitely not naturally occurring, and a lot of them are, I admit, quite rough, but a lot of them are also very elegant. If you get your hammer and chisel out and put a bit of grace and elegance and thought into it, you can make nice arches and pillars and smooth flat walls, and it can all be, pretty sophisticated architecture. And if you want a fancy term for digging caves into the sides of hillside, you can talk about negative architecture, which is what some architects and archaeologists like to use, because why use a simple word like cave when you can say negative architecture? Now, there is a problem with negative architecture, and not that it's just a bit of a fancy term. It's also, how do you date it? You see, normally archaeologists look at what rubbish people threw away into the pits and so forth, but of course if you're living in a cave, you don't throw away your rubbish in the cave, you throw it out of the cave. So you're not leaving any dating information by your rubbish in the cave. But you can look at a building and see, this bit was built and then that bit was added and so forth, and that's normally how, with, what should we call it, positive architecture, how things go, and so you can date things that way. This must have come after that, etc. But with negative architecture, it doesn't work like that. You dig a small cave and people live and do stuff in that small cave for a very long time and perhaps leave all sorts of clues, all of which are then removed when some later people decide to enlarge the cave. And that removes all of the evidence of the previously existing cave. You then get a completely new cave. Was it the first cave? Was there a pre-existing cave? There's no way an archaeologist can tell a lot of the time. And so this is a big problem with trying to investigate caves in negative architecture, at least negative architecture spaces. There you go, I got an extra word in places like this. So when people make claims for how big the city was at a particular time, was it even a city? Oh, it must have been a city because they had so many caves. Did they, though? Because the caves we're looking at now have all been altered so many times that they all appear to be fairly recent, but some of the stuff is very, very old. So, yeah, it's a big problem, dating with negative architecture.
Some houses go very deep. You can see the chisel and pick marks on the walls. The air is damp and cool, with water evaporating from the limestone. Here is a very common style of room with a low central floor, a raised bench down either side, and a shallow trough near the wall where things would be stored. Here we see an example of such a trough filled with barrels. This is an example of what would have been a middle-class home. The door leads into a sort of closed courtyard. That's a stove, pantry, skylight there, rubbish chute, or possibly loo, perhaps both, a hole leading down to the cistern, and to one side of the main room a space for the animals. This is a manger, a food trough for the livestock. And this, let me talk about this.
You can see deep grooves cut into the stone, vertical ones there, long, horizontal, and more. So what is this? Are these marking for some calendar or something? I'm an archaeologist. Am I going to use the word ritual? No, I'm not, because these are signs that they were planning to do more excavation. This is the living rock, and they were going to expand the room in that direction. And so rather than just chip away tiny bits and create a great pile of scree on the floor, which you then have to get rid of, they would chip in this methodical way, because then it's possible to lift out an entire useful block at a time. So not only are you expanding the cave that you live in, but you're also creating building material for some other building somewhere else. Right, as perhaps you can hear, I'm in a cistern. A cistern was a large underground space. It was the storage of water. And above me, you can see that it's been blocked up at some point in the past. There was a hole in the top of this for getting the water in and out. And the sides of this are made out of limestone. So these would have been a bit porous. And of course, limestone being completely permeable, everything would have drained out the bottom. So they lined the bottom with some reasonably water-resistant mix of clays and ground-up pottery and the like. I'm not entirely sure how much of that surface survives that I'm standing on now. But this later got converted, because over here there is a flight of steps that was added later. And you can imagine that would somewhat ruin the waterproofing of the cistern. because this got converted into an ice cellar. Now, the ice was naturally occurring snow, so you can shovel a load of that in, but if you just shovel it all into one great big block, that wouldn't work very well. What you wanted to do was layer it with insulation. So they would put down a layer of something like straw to act as an insulating layer, then put down a load of snow on that, compact that down, put on another layer of snow, and repeat up inside here. So they need to be able to get down in here with their shovels and various other tools to achieve that. And the last snows might be gathered in perhaps February in this part of the world. And amazing, I have been told, and this is pretty impressive, I've been told that with an ice cellar this big, if it was properly packed, you could actually have ice all year round.
If troglodytism appeals to you, then this could be a place to break you in gently. This is a hotel dining room. The little niches are old sconces where a candle or oil lamp would sit. There are seashells in the ceiling to confuse Christians. Again and again you'll see nature bursting forth in lithic form. There isn't the usual simple separation of rock and building, of above ground and below. Rock intermingles with architecture. I wonder what that was. Hang on, these ones have got electric lights in. How did they do that? Oh, I see. The cable went up to there, and then they drilled... I'm not sure I approve. To get to my breakfast terrace, I had to pass through the living rock, through a tunnel not quite curved enough to keep out the wind, sunlight, or birds.
I've just had breakfast on this terrace, and yes, the camera is going to have a difficult time coping with the contrast here, but never mind. In the background, an extraordinary view of Matera. Now, there are nice things to see over there, but when people come out onto this terrace, they don't say, my goodness, look at the amazing rock formations, aren't they beautiful? Instead, they say, wow, look at that town over there, it's so beige. Now, why is it that we like views like this quite as much as we do? That's what I've been thinking to myself about. Now, if aliens were to come down and observe us, would they find us mad that we find the site of a load of old buildings inefficiently wired and plumbed in? It's a nicer site to look at than a modern, much more efficiently plumbed and wired in housing estate with its shiny glass and new brick. Why do humans prefer the sight of something like that? A load of higgledy-pickledy old, half-tumble-down buildings. Now, granted, they are beige, but there's got to be something more to it than that. Now, in this particular instance, we can see, presented to the viewer, the walls of many, many buildings all at once, because they're built on a steep hillside, and we tend not to see that with modern housing estates, because defence is not much of a consideration now, and so we tend to build on the flat. It's easier and cheaper. Easy to get the roads in for a start. But we love it. We look at that and we go, it's old and unplanned. It's somehow organic and at one with the landscape or something. But is it? I mean, when people back in the day when those buildings were built looked upon them, did they think that these buildings are one with the landscape, or were they trying to create a work of man that was quite different from the works of nature, quite distinct? I must admit to some frustration. I can't quite put my finger on why we like this quite so much. We like old things, but oldness on its own does not explain why we like a view like that. It's not like a huge planned St. Petersburg. It doesn't have the huge vast lines that someone with authority has created on a map. Each individual building has been made to the whim of the individual builder, and that gives it this higgledy-pickledy look. But of course, the fact that it's built on a rocky hillside gives it that as well. Yes, I'm only going to... I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't. But it's definitely the case that we love an old town.
A little bit of Italy there. Now, back here in the real world, I have to tell you about my sponsor, Audible. Now, if you have been living under a massive rock for ages, and yet you're watching this video, so clearly you still have access to the internet, then even under your current circumstances, you're near certainly aware that my sponsor, Audible, is a massive website that sells audiobooks. And if you go to www.audible.com/Lindybeige, or if you prefer this sort of thing, you could text Lindybeige to 500 500, then you could find out details of an introductory offer they have. You can get a free audiobook, which is yours to keep forever, and you can browse around the whole site, possibly later choose to take up the monthly membership scheme they have, and you can download Audible Originals. Now, an Audible Original is something that Audible itself has commissioned. It's not available anywhere else. They've got quite a wide selection with lots of stars involved. And it used to be that you could get those two, and then they threw in 2 free per month. Well, now the limits are off. You can have as many Audible Originals as you like, which I think is rather generous of them. Almost suspiciously so. Anyway, I thought, given the granted rather tenuous James Bond connection of this video, that I would type in James Bond and see what I got. And I got really quite a lot. Now, I was aware, as doubtless you are already, that Ian Fleming wrote 14 James Bond books, 2 of which, can't call them novels because they're collections of short stories. So I was a little surprised when I saw, for instance, that High Time to Kill, that definitely sounds like a Bond title, High Time to Kill is book 32 in the series. But hey, Trigger Mortis, is that a good title? I don't know. Trigger Mortis is book 45. So it seems that quite a few other authors have been carrying on Ian Fleming's tradition. And you can get them read to you in so many different ways. You want to hear an audiobook of a James Bond novel in Dutch, German, French? Yeah, they've got those. Or maybe you want a particular person reading it. Well, they've got quite a stellar lineup of people narrating these audiobooks. Do you want to hear James Bond narrated by David Tennant? Well, you can! Or Hugh Bonneville, or Toby Stevens, or Kenneth Branagh, or Roy Kinnear. No, not Roy Kinnear. Rory Kinnear. Sorry, Roy Kinnear was his dad, who was a comedy genius, by the way, but that's a bit of a digression. Or who else? Bill Nighy, the inevitable Martin Jarvis, Tom Hiddleston, Damian Lewis, and possibly a little confusingly, Rosamund Pike. Now, you might think it very odd for a woman to be given the gig, but actually I can imagine that that might be quite good, although the particular book she's narrating is The Spy Who Loved Me. And if you are a Bond fan, you will know that the book, which is quite short, is told from a woman's perspective. Although it's a Canadian woman, so Rosamund has to put on the accent, but then she does, so that's all right then. Anyway, so there are an awful lot of James Bond audiobooks available on Audible, if that's the sort of thing you like. There's even a series of young James Bond audiobooks in which the schoolboy James Bond is even at that stage in his life, foiling plots to take over the world. No, I mean, I suppose to foul the plot. I wouldn't take over the world, but now you've fouled my plot. No. No, right. To foul a plot is it's maybe funnier, but it's not what I meant to say. Foiling plots to take over the world and stuff. Oh yeah, the stakes were high, even when he was an Etonian. And if you don't want straightforward stories, they've got audiobooks about the music of James Bond, about the science of James Bond. What else? About the biographies, of course, of Ian Fleming and various other people involved, and the film stuff. And the one which caught my eye was everything I learned about life, I learned from James Bond. So there you go. There's another Bond-related book audiobook, I should say, that might interest you. And you're very likely to be into that sort of thing because you're almost certain, if you're watching this video, to be male and of that sort of age. So yeah, you might be into Bond. And if you are, well, why not try Audible?
I seem to have a lot of bad luck with tourist information offices. I went several times to the main office in Valletta, for instance, on Malta, and every single time was told incorrect information. Anyway, I've just been to the main official tourist information centre here, just trying to organise transport away from Matera. I wanted, for instance, to go to the railway station. They had trouble telling me where it was, but eventually I found out where it was. They were only out by 90 degrees, and it was shut. They didn't tell me that it's shut on Sundays. Anyway, I've just been to another tourist information centre that was just a few yards from the main bus station here at this bustling tourist destination, and they were not able to tell me anything at all about how to get a ticket, when the buses go, or anything like that, nor could they think of anyone who might be able to tell me. I was a little disappointed.
But then I had some gelato and stopped griping. Right, let's talk about sewerage. This model shows the two streams that passed slowly through the Sassy, into which all the effluent, and all that goes with it, was thrown until the 1950s. This further explains the reliance on cisterns. The streams were gradually covered over with fewer and fewer gaps for children to fall through, and today, on the surface, they are roads. In the 16th century, next to and beneath this church, the remains of which were recently excavated revealing medieval frescoes, they built a particularly massive cistern and then, amazingly, at some unknowable time in the past, they completely forgot about it. In 1991 it was rediscovered, and after investigation by scuba divers it became a major tourist attraction. It was filled to the top with about 5,000 tons of water, and the walls were an amazing record of water levels of the past. Different bands of colour formed on the surface of the walls, depending on which impurities were in the water at the time. You can see holes in the ceiling down which buckets would have been lowered. Objects floating on the surface would chip away at the stains. This bit looks as though you could play it on the piano. Here you see the rust stain left by a floating bucket that was trapped against the ceiling for a very long time.
One thing you see everywhere in the Sassy today are these very cutesy Roman-style drain pipes, which I rather appreciate. Now, in the Roman period, if you want to make a long pipe, one way to do this would be to make lots of short ceramic tubes and then link them together like this. And so you can create, well, we've got a drain pipe here, and you can see that other pan tiles have been used to create little chutes and gutters and so forth. And you might think, isn't that wonderful? They're still using the old technology. But there is a misleading implication there, which is that there has been continuity here. In fact, a lot of these, in fact most of these, are very modern. The original roofs drained not off eaves into the street, shedding the water off the entire building, but they just directed the rain outwards to the walls, and the walls being made out of superabsorbent limestone, which of course is a permeable rock, would soak the water up like a sponge and then take it down to the various cisterns. It was a way of collecting water. You collected the rainwater from your house. You didn't want it to run off your house into the street. You wanted it to run into cisterns and other storage devices. So it's only after modern plumbing has been added that then people don't want damp walls and all that sort of stuff. So instead they channel the water to outside their building and down one of these cutesy and by me appreciated drain pipes. Now these ones have steel brackets. And I am told, though I haven't discovered this for myself anyway yet, there are examples that use the older technique of using cattle bones as brackets to hold the drain pipes. If I see one, I shall photograph it for you.
On the outskirts of town, there is a bizarre castle. I thought at first it might be a folly, but it seems not. It is the Castello Tramontano, built by the Count of Matera in 1501. The locals were an unruly lot. The area was famous for its brigands, and they had thrown off several previous overlords, so this count decided to build this thing, not to defend the town, but to enforce feudal dominance over it. The castle was never finished. The Materani didn't like the heavy taxes imposed to pay for the castle, so in 1514 they had a meeting, and then killed him as he came out of the cathedral. Back to the cathedral now, and crikey, that really is clean. Let's hope the pigeons don't spoil the pure beige expanses. But, look, sorry, I'm going to have to point out a few things here because they are bothering me. At the bottom in the middle, you've got this big bit above the main door, fine, and on top of that, in the middle, you've got this fella. But having him in the middle just draws attention to the fact that this window is not in the middle. Look, it's clearly off to the right. This is the vertical centre line of the window, and this is the centre line of the figure above it. So you have to make a correction to the line, but moving up through him, we come to here, which isn't the centre of the top little arch, so you have to make another correction, and then another at the very top. And this section is clearly narrower than this bit. It's off in the vertical as well. If you draw a horizontal line from the top of this capping stone, it doesn't line up with the top of this one, which is clearly a foot higher up in my book. You've got to make your mind up. You either embrace asymmetry or symmetry, but things all being slightly off-white, it's just wrong! The town has in it a temple to some weird death cult that puts skulls on everything. Ugh. But it was all right, because just across the road in the kiosk, oh joy, they had the latest issue of Mussolini magazine.
The smell coming off this is just amazing. It's like being punched in the face by a florist.
This won the Salata, the smallest and least accessible roof terrace award. Tough competition. New wall, old wall.
Not sure how much I like this idea. The chimney from downstairs is right on the terrace here, and there's a chimney actually over a restaurant. Cough, cough.
Oh, nice day for it. There was a Salvador Dali exhibition in town.
It's 8 o'clock in the evening and everything's still open. Even the tourist information, which was pretty handy for me.
MATERA might look even better at night.
Now, if you wanted to do a foot chase in a film, you could pick very few places better than this, because there are so many nooks and crannies and changes of direction. Just where I'm standing right now, there are so many potential directions in which a chaser or pursuant could go, and the number of options is just, myriad. And, of course, in a film, you can cheat, because you can go round a corner and then reveal someone having gone round a different corner, and who would know? Well, in a place like this, I imagine you'd have to know the place amazingly well to spot all the cheats. Here's a solution to the age-old problem of what do you do when you have lots of stepped streets but you want to move a heavy load in some wheeled thing like a wheelbarrow up one of these streets? Well, what you can do is you can put in loads of these little mini ramps which appear here to be for some 2 or 4 wheeled thing, but notice that they're not actually in a straight line. Why is that? Could they not have got them straighter than that? Did they think that anything breaking the you must use legs rule should at least meander a bit? Now it's 10:10 in the evening and still almost everything is still open. True, most of the jewellers and expensive dress shops have shut, but if you needed a tourist knick-knack or anything to eat or drink, well, yep, there are plenty of options.
That should hold it. People used to deny that they had been brought up in the Sassy. Today it is a badge of honour, but before you get all misty-eyed about the good old days, understand that 16,000 people lived cheek by jowl in extreme poverty. Malaria was rife and infant mortality very high. Today about half the buildings are lived in, many part-time, by about 3,000 people.
Now I have something to tell you about MATERA which might blow your mind. Most of you are of course quite safe because most of my audience is made up of stout-minded types whose minds are frankly unblowable, and I'm very proud of you. But if you're new to this channel, then brace yourself. Now we're used to the modern state, so you think of Italy and anything within Italy must be Italian, right? Subject to the same laws, speaking the same language, spending the same currency, all that sort of thing. Yes, you've heard of San Marino and Vatican City, but never mind about those. We think of the modern nation state. So, when we know that the whole of Italy is a Roman area, well, imagine that all the cities within it will be Roman. Well, behind me, you see, quite an old and reasonably large city, which was never Roman. MATERA was never Roman. There's no archaeological evidence of Romans having settled there. There's no literary reference. All right, I have heard one, it was Pliny, I think, who said that there was a mule track that went there, but whoop-de-doo. It seems that the Romans just didn't bother with places like MATERA. They bothered with places like Bari and Tarentum, places of strategic importance, ports and the like. But if something was inland and uphill and out of the way and didn't have a big army that threatened them, they could just leave it alone, and so they never bothered conquering a lot of these places, and they carried on with their own local customs and local religions and the like for a very long time. Now, this is quite a harsh region. It's a lot of the land around MATERA is rather waterless and arid, and so that's one reason that perhaps the Romans wouldn't have bothered with it. It wasn't very productive. In the 1930s, the fascists found that this area was quite useful as a sort of huge open-air internment camp. You didn't need armed guards following everyone, all these dangerous intellectuals and unreliable artists with rifles and keen eyes. That is, the people following them, not the artists, although I imagine a lot of artists also had keen eyes. But you know what I mean. They didn't have to go to all that trouble because you could just dump these people in somewhere like MATERA, and where are they going to go? If they manage to slip out at night unnoticed into the countryside, well, good luck to them. There's not a lot of water about. So that's one sign of how inhospitable the area was. And in the 1930s, places like MATERA were sometimes described as somewhat godless. Yes, if you go there today, you'll see loads of churches, and you will say, well, hang on, there are loads of churches here. Well, yeah, there are a lot of churches in MATERA, but for a lot of the time they were just used as cattle barns. Anyway, you may be wondering why the colour of the city seems to have changed. One moment it was a magnificent beige, and now it seems to have gone all white. Yeah. Well, that's because behind me, that's not MATERA. No, that's Ostuni. But it's another similar city in that the Romans didn't ever come here either. Now, there is a legend that explains why Ostuni is painted white. Brace yourself. It seems that the Black Death was sweeping across Europe, and certain places were spared. And if someone's home was spared, they would paint it white to show that that house was not infected with the plague. And because this entire city was mostly spared from the plague, the entire city ended up white. I have two problems with this. One is that I'm fairly sure there's evidence for the town having been painted white before the plague, but also, and for me this is really the clincher, it doesn't make any sense at all. If someone's not got the plague today and you paint his house white, well, he might have the plague tomorrow, and then what are you going to do? Chip all the surface of the outside of the house off to get the paint off? No. No, but it's very nice. It's a very pretty city, and there's another maze of passages. These ones are much easier to walk around, though, because whereas the passages that link all the sassi in MATERA are cobbled with these smooth, large stones that have been worn to shiny slipperiness by the feet of myriads over the centuries, instead here they're much rougher and easier to grip. Certainly, if you ever intend to visit places like this, don't wear high heels.